thousands of fresh deals at your Nordstrom Rack store. Save big today on new arrivals from Sam Edelman, Cole Haan, Adidas, Madewell, and Marc Jacobs. Brands you love, trends you crave, and amazing savings. We're talking up to 60% off. Score so much new at Nordstrom Rack for so much less. But hurry, get first dibs on the season's best, up to 60% off, now at your Nordstrom Rack store. What will you find?
Hey guys, this is Keenan Thompson. I have a problem with you. Yes, you. None of y'all told me that AutoTrader has millions of new and used cars that I can shop from home. I thought we were friends. I put smiles on your face, but I'm not smiling. No one told me that with AutoTrader, a dealer can deliver cars to my home or that I could shop by price on AutoTrader. No one. Consider this friendship that you just learned we had officially over. Finally, it's easy. AutoTrader.
Ladies and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. So I am in New York City at an exceptionally mediocre hotel. And I leave from here for Florida for a better hotel. But I am nothing if not a servant of the Remnant listeners. So we are continuing apace with new episodes. A bunch of people have asked me for more AEI colleagues, and I again am your servant. So I have for the first time my colleague from the American Enterprise Institute, Dalibor Rohac. I should say Dalibor Rohac, even though he has conceded that Americans will just never be able to pronounce a standalone C at the end of a name the way you're supposed to in Slovakian. He's my colleague at AEI. He's a senior fellow. He's also a research associate at the Wilfried Martin Center for European Studies in Brussels and a fellow at the Anglo-American University in Prague. His books include Towards an Imperfect Union, A Conservative Case for the EU, and that's right, In Defense of Globalism. He also contributes to the AEI podcast, The Eastern Front, which is primarily about European security. So we should probably talk about something about European security or the EU or things of that nature. Dalibor, welcome to the Remnant.
Jonah, thank you so much. This has been on my bucket list for a long time. So whatever happens next, I can now die as a happy man.
So I got to ask, because I love accents. How often do people ask you if you're Austrian? Because there's a little bit of a Schwarzenegger ring to your accent.
It's funny that you say that. I always thought that I had a very sort of thick Slavic accent, but most Americans, I don't think, can sort of pin it down very easily. So I was, the sort of mention of German or Swedish actually, on a couple of occasions, sort of surprised me. And I've sort of given up any hope on trying to do anything with my accent. I think I'm just sort of stuck with it for the rest of my life.
Oh, it's a good accent. The Austrian comes in mind in part because of the sound, but also because you're about 400 pounds and a huge muscle-bound guy. And
it also chimes well with Raihan Salam's claim about me, namely that I was a Danubian thinker, referring to my, love of Hayek and international federalism and that kind of stuff.
So why don't we start with the grimmest part? What's your assessment of how the war in Ukraine is going right now? Are you upbeat about Ukraine's future? Sanguine? How do you see it?
Joe, I have to say I'm concerned, and I've become more concerned over the past couple of weeks, especially talking to my friends, people on the sort of central left in the think tank industry who I suspect are more attuned to the thinking of the administration than I am on this, where there seems to be a sort of new conventional wisdom congealing, namely that this war will come to an end at some point, and there'll be negotiations, and those negotiations will not be preceded by a sound and decisive defeat of Russia. I always took it as a given since the beginning of this war that the only way this can end is if the Russians are driven out of Ukraine, if the Kremlin is soundly defeated, if it's clear to everybody, Putin included, and then you can negotiate about what's next and what sort of shape and form the peace settlement takes. And my sense is that we might be getting to the negotiations phase before that happens, and I think that would be a terrible mistake on our part. And it would be a direct result from where I sit of the drip approach towards helping Ukraine, giving them, just what they need to defend themselves and keep the Russians at bay, but not enough for them to be able to retake that territory. I hope I'm wrong in this, but if it does happen, I suspect it will only be a temporary respite from fighting. It would give Russia a chance, an opportunity to rebuild its military, reconstitute, and then launch hostilities at some point later. And there's always this sort of cop-out that the administration is using, and obviously Europeans as well, which they say, well, it's up to Ukrainians to decide when they want to negotiate and what sort of compromise they want to strike with Russia. But it's a cop-out because we obviously have near absolute control over the kind of assistance and the military assistance in particular that the Ukrainians get. So if we reduce our aid to a trickle, then the range of options available to the Ukrainians is much smaller than if we are front-loading the assistance and enable the Ukrainians to conduct major offensive operations. So I've been always, since the beginning, I'm struggling with this. The assistance to Ukraine has, as my colleague Giselle, friend of the AI says, it's been one of the best things that the administration have done, and it also has been one of the most frustrating things we've witnessed because of the sort of slowness and the hesitant nature of the response.
So we should sort of do a level setting here. What is your? It is such a strange time because the people you end up having to make the case for why this is important for America or for national security, or just simply the right thing to do, tend to be on the right, which normally they would be on the left, but things are so scrambled these days. What is your case for why it is in America's interest that Russia lose and Ukraine win in this? Is it a realist argument? Is it a idealistic argument? Because you are a EU guy, and those are fighting words for a lot of people in the Republican Party. So what is your case for just a rational, cold analysis about why it's in American interest to see this thing through to a Ukrainian victory?
I think there are many different arguments you could make. You can talk about, a rules-based order and our interest in preserving a Europe in which borders are not being revised by force, the sort of precedent this would set for other countries around the world. But I think ultimately, it was Senator Mitch McConnell who I think very succinctly described what the case for helping Ukraine was around the time of Zelensky's visit to Washington in December, when he said, it's not an act of charity. It's not something we do because we are nice or because we are sort of guided by the sort of higher ideals of how the international sphere should be organized. It's really about us making sure that Europe remains stable, remains prosperous. The European continent is major trading partner, major ally. We need Europeans to help us deal with China down the road, and so the idea that you should allow Russian tanks on the border of NATO along all that long border that NATO countries share with Ukraine. It's certainly not something that would be in our sort of. It's certainly not in Europe European security interest, and it's certainly not in ours either, because we are treaty bound to defend those countries. I mean, defending Poland becomes much more harder if Ukraine becomes a destabilized and more dangerous country, being subverted by Russia, etc., etc. I mean, the economic chaos that downfall of Ukraine would provoke would, again, not be good for America's working classes, McConnell says, and I agree. And there is also something to be said about setting precedents. I mean, it's not a coincidence that we are having a very intense conversation about Taiwan, about risks to Taiwan's security, and people are sort of waking up to everything that needs to be done to help Taiwan defend itself in case of a Chinese invasion, and that's been really set in motion by this experience of Ukraine. So our sort of immediate interest, I think, are really help Ukrainians. Whatever happens to Ukraine, I think our immediate interest is to help Ukrainians just erode and debilitate Russian military capabilities to the point at which Russia ceases to be a major threat to its neighbors, and there is an opportunity to do that, and do that for a generation. So even if you sort of don't believe in any of the international order stuff, here is an adversary that we are facing, and there's somebody else doing the fighting, and we are just spending order of tens of billions to help those people do the fighting. I think it's a tremendous deal for Americans if you are a realist.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I going back, one of the common themes on this podcast is how I hate monocausal explanations for things that are complicated, and I first started obsessing about that in the run up to the Iraq War, where I remember Tim Russert, who was then the host of Meet the Press, would continuously ask administration officials, what's the one reason we should do this? What is the one reason? And it's like you don't go into a war for a single, sometimes you go for a single reason if they invade you, right? Like Pearl Harbor was the one reason we declared war on Japan, and that was totally fine. But normally, when you're doing something complicated and important, you do it for a bunch of different reasons. And for me, it's a checklist, and of the reasons why we should be doing this.
But we should also just stress that we are not fighting the war, and nobody's sort of advocating us fighting the war.
That's right. I just want to come up with this recently. This is one of my big problems with the debates about this, is that almost everybody's arguing about hypothetical things, and nobody's actually arguing about what the actual policy is. And so, you have people like Andy Biggs saying we can't give them tanks because Americans are going to end up in the tanks. Sort of the predicate of that is that you'd be okay if we were giving tanks and Americans didn't end up in the tanks. And that's actually what the policy is. So, it's very frustrating, but I can see there are a handful of reasons I can see that against helping Ukraine. And then there's just dozens of reasons to help Ukraine. The pros and con list is really asymmetric. And, the fear of nuclear war is one, but at the same time, if that overrides everything else, then basically we have to have a policy of Russia can do whatever it wants if it's going to threaten to do nuclear war. We can't have that policy. And then the other ones are like, it's expensive. It is expensive, but it's cheaper than a lot of the alternatives. And then on the pro side, it's the right thing. There's a moral case, there's an idealistic case, there's a realpolitik case. And but the debate in the States, at least, is purely about ifs and buts, and not about the facts on the ground. And it's not really a debate as far as I can tell, right? Like Kevin McCarthy's argument is we can't give the Ukrainians a blank check, and we haven't been giving them a blank check. And so it's like punching jello. It's a very difficult argument to have because no one's actually making real arguments.
It would be I guess it would be quite helpful if we had actually a sort of conversation about oversight and whether there needs to be an inspector general appointed especially for this particular purpose, although the 3 inspector generals from Defense, State Department, the USAID traveled to Ukraine last week. There is There are all kinds of oversight sort of mechanisms put in place, both for the military equipment. There are GPS trackers on everything. There is no evidence that any of the weapons would be diverted away from the front lines. I mean, it all ends on the battlefield. And then when it comes to the actual money, most of the assistance that Ukrainians are getting is being disbursed through international financial institutions. And we are not living in the 1960s where governments would be getting big checks. I mean, there is a lot of oversight and a lot of sort of rigor that goes into that process. On the other hand,
and most of the money actually stays in America because we're buying stuff, we send them the stuff.
So much of the military assistance is being spent on refilling Pentagon stocks, and we are sending them, old stuff that's been sitting there that was being decommissioned. The same is true of the Europeans, right? They are discovering that they have these Leopard 1 tanks from the 70s sitting in stocks. They need to be repaired. They'll be sent to Ukraine. They'll have to buy, new equipment, I guess, to refill those stocks. I mean, it's defense experts would tell you that much of this spending is stuff that should have been happening regardless of what happens in Ukraine. That there have been these sort of overdue, just sort of lack of investment into our defense capabilities and modernization that is only occurring as a result of this, which is very much in our interest.
All right, so let's move over to the EU. Explain, since you're a Danubian thinker, what the hell is going on with Germany? Because on the one hand, their recalibration to defense spending and all that has been so welcome. And on the other hand, it seems like every single time they make a step forward, they have to make a half step backwards, or they always sound like, remember, when if you played chess, particularly when you're a little kid, you just agonize about letting go of the piece because then you can't take it back. And so you move the piece and then you just keep your fingers pinched on it forever. That seems to be what's going on with every major decision they make. Is it's incredibly reluctant, teeth-pulling exercise. Do you think the new German perspective is going to stay, or are they going to backslide again?
I mean, that's the sort of $1,000 question. I'm really not sure what the answer is, because to me, the German attitude has been at least as frustrating as the sort of US discussion. It's in some ways a version of the same debate about escalation. What are the fears of us doing more for the Ukrainians, sending them more? I mean, Germany has been very sort of forthcoming in trying to address the issue of their energy dependency on Russia and trying to just sort of move away from just depending on Russian natural gas. We can have quibbles with the way they are going about it. I mean, a lot of it consisted of throwing a lot of money at German businesses in a sort of unilateral fashion that annoyed everybody else in Europe. But I think there has been a sort of realization that Russia is not a reliable partner. I think Chancellor Scholz was ultimately sincere when he delivered this address. Was it almost a year ago? The Zeitenwende speech, where he says the world has changed, we have to adjust. Announced a new 100 billion fund to sort of rebuild German armed forces. Has been very little progress on that front domestically in sort of beefing up German military capabilities, and there has been this sort of teeth-pulling process of providing assistance to Ukrainians and creating these artificial red lines that 3 months later the Germans would cross, just as we had our own red lines that we sort of crossed. So I think it's worth sort of thinking through the politics of the moment. There obviously is that sort of post-war shadow of these sort of horrors that Germans inflicted on the rest of Europe, and a real fear of a strong Germany. In Germany itself, there is, I guess, Germany was the nation that sort of embodied this embrace of the idea of progress and overcoming conflict as an integral part of politics. I mean, you see it in the sort of consensual nature of German politics, coalition governments, and you have a consensus that's congealed. It's very difficult to change it, and this war came as a shock. But I wonder if it's enough of a shock to really change Germany in a sustained way. One reason why I'm somewhat skeptical is because clearly German public opinion is split on how much forthcoming Germany should be and how much assistance it should provide Ukraine and how decisive Ukrainian victory should look like. When you look at the political parties, you really have to go to the fringes, to the AfD and to the Die Linke to have sort of to hear explicitly pro-Russian voices or anti-Ukrainian voices. Christian Democrats in the opposition, the Free Democrats, the Greens, are being very vocal in their support for Ukraine. So you have to wonder whether that does not create an opening for the SPD, a party that traditionally has been investing in ties with Russia and has a long history, starting with former Chancellor Schroeder of trying to do business with Russia, hoping that doing business with Russia will somehow change the country. That whether that party and its leader, who happens to be the Chancellor, does not see an opening in being the sort of more prudent, more careful voice on these matters, and one who would ultimately if not a return to a status quo ex ante, but at least some kind of quasi-normalization of the relationship.
I mean, you're being diplomatically kind to Gerhard Schroeder, who is basically
he's a crook. I mean, if your listeners have any sort of questions,
he's a paid vassal of the Russian government and or of Gazprom or whatever. I mean, and I just was listening to the Telegraph podcast about Ukraine, which I'm kind of addicted to, and
it's Francis Dernley, right, and his colleagues. They're excellent.
Yeah,
not quite as good as our podcast, the Eastern Front.
Of course not. But very good. And but I did not know that Gerhard Schroeder has been married so many times that his nickname in Germany is the Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah,
which I just thought was great.
That's very funny.
So, I mean, it seems to me that one of the reasons why Germany matters is not just because it's the biggest economy, in Europe. I assume it's the biggest economy in Europe, right? I mean, what would be bigger?
Yep.
France, yeah. And but because I was listening to an interview with a French journalist recently, and France struggles with its Ukraine support too, because Macron is an egghead who thinks he can order everything off menu and in a bespoke way on all his policies. But the one refrain is that she said is that we're better than Germany, and I can see why in a lot of Europe that's a standard, right? Like if Germany is here, then we can all be 10% better, and that's why I think Germany matters in a lot of ways. Is if it gives much less maneuvering room for other reluctant countries. If Germany, you can't just say, oh, we're more pacifistic, or we're more toadying to Russia than Germany. I mean, that's just not a safe place for anybody to be. And yet it just doesn't seem like Germany can maintain a line on this.
So what I struggle with is really this undeniable fact that both France and Germany are doing much more and are being more effective at helping Ukraine than anybody could have expected reasonably a year ago.
Right.
So by that token, we have seen a major transformation, and actually, just to sort of defend Germans for a bit, the military equipment that they've sent to the Ukrainians is making a big difference. Even before the Leopard decision was made, they were sending these Gepard anti-air sort of vehicles, the Iris-T missiles. Now, we've come a long way from the 5,000 helmets that were announced initially. So it's 250,000 winter hats I saw on the website of the Bundeswehr, and 116,000 winter jackets. No, I'm sort of joking, but it's part of the package. But there are lots of serious,
Sure, yeah.
Good equipment that the Ukrainians are putting to good use, and the same is true of the French. One constraint obviously is that the industrial base and the stocks of these militaries are limited, and so even if they were to really go all in and try to give as much as possible, it just would be no match for the Americans, and then we would still have a major role to play in all that. But there is this there is this reluctance for the French. It's not in a way, given France's geography, Eastern Europe is far away. They are preoccupied with what's happening in the Maghreb, with terrorism, with that kind of stuff, and and obviously Macron is, in the sort of French sort of tradition of trying to be the smartest person in the room, and he got these ideas from his mentor Paul Ricoeur that you should address every crisis by doing thesis and antithesis and synthesis, overcoming the contradictions. Hence this sort of diplomatic effort and the aid to Ukraine going on at the same time. Germans are sort of stuck in the past to some extent, and sort of haunted by the sort of shadows of everything that happened in the first half of the 20th century. But I'm not sure whether the glass is half full or half empty. To me, the big question is, are we doing enough for Ukrainians to win? And to that, the answer, sorry to say, is no. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We are probably going into a fighting season in which Russia will attempt some form of offensive in the Donbass. It probably won't be terribly successful, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that the Ukrainians are on track to retake the country this year. And if they don't do it this year, they will have lost another 50,000 men. Will they say, let's do it for another year? I'm not quite sure.
Okay, let's take a second to hear from our sponsor. So the other week, there was this horrible, gruesome, I'm not trying to make light of story about this guy, Brian Walsh, who done all of these terrible Google searches for how to dispose of a body, how long does it take for a body to decompose? Can I be charged with murder if they don't find the body, whatever? And I joked on Twitter at the time, and that's why I use ExpressVPN. Now, to be fair, you shouldn't get ExpressVPN so that you can murder your wife or anybody else. But you should get ExpressVPN if you're concerned about people seeing what you're doing on the internet. Because ExpressVPN is a great way to avoid getting spam, avoid getting ads that you don't want tracking you, following you all over the place. It's a great thing to use if you want to avoid getting hacked in any way whatsoever. Because using the internet without ExpressVPN is like checking in your baggage at the airport without a lock. You think your stuff is kept private, but you never know who's going through your belongings. Like, Lord knows that this is why people like Guy use a lock on his luggage, because you just don't want you don't want some guy in a TSA uniform going through that stuff in public. When you go online without a VPN, internet service providers can see every single website you visit. They can legally sell this information without your consent to ad companies and tech giants who then use your data to target you. When you use ExpressVPN, ISPs cannot see your online activity. It's like a lead shield preventing even Superman's X-ray vision from intruding upon your privacy. Your identity is anonymized by a secure VPN server, and your data is encrypted for maximum protection. ExpressVPN works on phones, laptops, even routers, so everyone who shares your Wi-Fi can be protected. Simply fire up the app and click one button. So, secure your online activity by visiting expressvpn.com/remnant today. That's expressvpn.com/remnant, REMNANT. And you can get an extra 3 months free. expressvpn.com/remnant.
Thousands of fresh deals at your Nordstrom Rack store. Save big today on new arrivals from Sam Edelman, Cole Haan, Adidas, Madewell, and Marc Jacobs. Brands you love, trends you crave, and amazing savings. We're talking up to 60% off. Score so much new at Nordstrom Rack for so much less. But hurry, get first dibs on the season's best, up to 60% off, now at your Nordstrom Rack store. What will you find?
So you're Slovakian.
Yep.
By birth, right? You're American now. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Why is it like? Explain to me how there can be what is the basis of pro-Russian sentiment in Eastern European countries? I mean, particularly Hungary. As you know, my wife's family, my father-in-law was Slovakian, and everybody I knew when I lived in Prague, just like the idea that you would sort of got to see both sides when it came to a Russian invasion of a bordering East European country, just seems so. It's very hard for my imagination to get around it, particularly when this isn't a complicated moral story, right? I mean, Russia's the bad actor; it's the villain. It's doing terrible things, and yet there are sizable numbers of people. I mean, I get it in Germany. I don't like it, but I get it, Ostpolitik and all that. But how can you be a Hungarian or a Slovakian or, I guess not a Pole, but how can you be one of these former captive nations and say, well, you got to hear both sides, or I have to understand where Russia is coming from? Where does that come from?
It's a fascinating question. I think the first thing to say is that Central and Eastern Europe is far from being homogeneous on these matters. And even when you look at the Czech Republic and Slovakia, I mean, there is a massive difference. I mean, the Czechs had recently the presidential election. In the run-up to the second round, one of the candidates, Andrej Babiš, was using these sort of anti-war, pro-peace, thinly veiled sort of anti-Ukrainian tropes, essentially to propel himself to what he thought would be a victory, and then he failed miserably. I mean, the Czechs just wouldn't have any of that, and they now have a sort of strongly Atlanticist president-elect, one that would sort of stress the need to help Ukraine at every instance. In Slovakia, public opinion seems to be much more divided, much like in, say, Hungary or Bulgaria or Greece, for that matter. And it's odd to sort of see that, given the historic experience. So Czechoslovakia was invaded by Soviet forces, and the whole Warsaw Pact in 1968. Hungary had an even much bloodier sort of experience with the Soviet invasion in 1956. And to me, I mean, the key really is sort of political leadership and the question of whether people in key positions in government and in the elite are using, various traumas of the past to not so much foster pro-Russian sentiments, but rather erode the commitment that these countries have in the Western alliance. So obviously Hungary has, its beef going back to 1920, the dismemberment of the greater Hungarian kingdom, and from that there is a certain sort of distrust of the West and Western powers. And Viktor Orbán, while he was in office, was sort of catering to those sentiments on a regular basis, unlike before. I mean, he used to be a very sort of Atlanticist leader. You can go back, watch his videos like from 2008, from the time when Georgia was invaded by Russia. I mean, he was, he was very sound on these matters 15 years ago. It's just while in office and while sort of transforming himself into what he is now, it was far more convenient for him to sort of play the victimhood card, to say that Hungary can't really put all its bets on, either the EU or the United States. We have to have a balanced foreign policy. We have to reach out to Russia and China. Hungary was among the most enthusiastic countries in the region to sign up for the Belt and Road Initiative, already in 2011. There were the summits with the Chinese. So it wasn't so much sort of being actively pro-Russian as really sort of putting little question marks in a sort of, again, in a sort of drip fashion over the importance of the transatlantic link. And you've seen something similar done in Slovakia by politicians who sort of belong to sort of major political parties. Not actively sort of advocating for Slovakia to say, leave NATO or the European Union, but sort of using every opportunity to say something sort of, anti-American or sort of anti-Western, or try to, bring Brussels into every sort of domestic political conflict. And that's just, that's very poor statecraft in my opinion, even though it does generate political gains. I mean, you don't see that in Poland. You don't see that in Poland, which is a massively polarized country, in some ways more polarized than, say, Slovakia. But there are some basic things that everybody in Poland agrees on, namely that we need, the Americans, we need to be part of these, Western integration structures in order to preserve our statehood. I mean, they sort of, get the big things in a way Slovaks, Hungarians just don't.
Yeah, so I take your point and your argument about the statesmanship or the national security strategy behind both sides. I mean, we saw a lot of that in the Cold War, the non-aligned movement, that kind of thing. I guess what I'm flummoxed by is the idea that you could go into a bar or a pub or a coffee shop and strike up a conversation with somebody, a Slovakian, a Hungarian, even I'm sure there are some Poles who see things differently, who is not a statesman, right? Who may be a mechanic or a salesman or whatever. I mean, they could be very, very educated or poorly educated, but regardless, just someone who actually, as a matter of conviction, sees this as a much more either complicated thing than it seems to me from my vantage point, or is actually just objectively pro-Russian. And I mean, maybe I should get a psychologist on to talk about that instead of you, but it's just a very strange thing to me.
It is very strange, and it certainly exists. I've been having this conversation with my parents, who, they live back in Slovakia. I've been flying a Ukrainian flag on our little townhouse in Arlington. They said that they probably wouldn't put a Ukrainian flag sticker on their car because it could get damaged. There would be sort of pro-Russian thugs going around and so on. There is a sort of bona fide neo-Nazi party in parliament. Is it sort of supply side driven, demand side driven is a very difficult question. But I think what's central to that, and what's sort of shared between, say, Slovakia and Hungary and other places, is not so much the affinity for Russia per se and the Kremlin, but rather sort of sense that we've been victims of the West. We've been somehow mistreated by Western powers. I mean, Hungarian story is the one of Trianon and the sort of dismemberment of Hungarian kingdom after the First World War. The Slovak story is, I would argue, far stupider than that. There is a sort of idea that after the collapse of communism, there was obviously a difficult transition in which heavy industries across Slovakia were being closed. And people blame Václav Havel, for example, who was the president of Czechoslovakia, for closing down, especially sort of like military equipment factories in sort of northern Slovakia. And the country had a very high unemployment rate throughout the 1990s. And there is sort of idea that this was all sort of a plot concocted by the Americans to do harm to Slovakia. Throughout the 1990s, when Slovakia for a while dropped out of the first wave of EU and NATO enlargements, there was this narrative that there is sort of a clique of Hungarians and Jews sort of plotting to do harm to us, that we've always been sort of victims throughout history, and we can't really trust the West. And that was coming from political leaders, and has become entrenched in a way that, like, if you want to be a sort of catch-all party leader, populist type, you just have to sort of cater to that sentiment in some shape or form.
You mentioned how there's a actual Nazi party in Slovakia, right? How many of those parties are? Because there's like trying to explain this to my daughter who doesn't have a. Let me put it this way: has a normal person's understanding of the politics of Eastern Europe and all that kind of thing. And she had asked me a while ago about this because, like, as you know, Putin is claiming, his original pretext for invading Ukraine was denazification, right? And Russia is obsessed, has basically turned itself into sort of a cargo cult of the Second World War. And they're convinced that everybody is a Nazi. And yet it seems like most of the Nazi parties or quasi parties in Europe are funded by Russians. Is that wrong? And we just saw this sort of essentially de facto Nazi in Sweden, turned out was the guy who did the Quran burning. Yep. And it turns out he was at one point basically an asset of Russia or de facto asset of Russia and that kind of thing. And like, how do the Nazi, the sort of the Nazi parties reconcile the fact that Putin is his ne plus ultra is denazification when these guys are all, sort of one degree or another Nazis? Or am I just misunderstanding the groundwork?
No, I don't think you're misunderstanding anything. But the distinction to be made is, I think, between propaganda that's sort of done for domestic purposes and for domestic consumption, and obviously in Russia, the memory of the Second World War and sort of horrific human cost that came with is still strong, and Putin's regime has been using that as much as possible, trying to sort of see itself as a successor, I suppose, to those efforts, and trying to frame conflicts that Russia is involved in as these sort of fights against Nazism. And it goes hand in hand, obviously, with the revival of the cult of Stalin in recent years. In Russia, it sort of plays to this, I guess, like, and our colleague Leon Aaron would tell you more about this narrative of Russia as a universal empire of sorts, mm-hmm. in a way that's not necessarily the message that's being sort of sent to those leaders of small fringe parties in Europe. That, I think, the Russian interest is really in trying to destabilize political systems across Europe. I'm fairly agnostic about how effective those efforts are, to what extent these parties are driven by sort of local popular demand and failures of local mainstream parties, etc. I think domestic conditions and sort of domestic politics are a much stronger driver of all this than any Russian funding. I'm not even sure much has been sort of proven with regard to the Slovak neo-Nazis and their Russian connections. I mean, yes, there have been mm-hmm. instances of like people working at the Russian embassy, like giving 500 euros per blog post to somebody, but like how much sort of effect that sort of buys the Russians in terms of sort of influence remains unclear. But humans are very good at dealing with cognitive dissonance mm-hmm. Until it sort of reaches proportions that are just too difficult to bear and too many contradictions to deal with. And I think it's one of those things where I don't think neo-Nazis across Europe think very deeply about the sort of meaning of Russian domestic propaganda. They for them is much more their dislike of the West, their dislike of the United States, their dislike of the European Union, their dislike of immigrants, their dislike of in some cases wokeism and all these sort of new fashions that are being brought into our public cultural life just trumps all of those contradictions that sort of exist on their side.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's probably right. I mean, my experience is that I like good arguments so much that I assume I project that on others, and there's just a lot of people who are very comfortable having very contradictory opinions, and it's sort of like the Joker in Dark Knight. Some people just want to see the world burn, right? And they don't really care about arguments. And the one place I'll disagree with you slightly, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but I'll just say, there's been a lot of pushback lately, Twitter files stuff about how the Russia collusion thing was, manufactured, and that's all fine. I'm not going to get into an argument about that. But I will say that, having, in the 2016 election cycle, the Anti-Defamation League ranked me, I think, 6 on the list of victims of anti-Semitic attacks on social media. And I will say that, when I would look at some of these, pictures that had me in a gas chamber and that kind of stuff, and I would go through those feeds, it started to turn Cyrillic pretty quickly, right? And again, I have no idea if that's Russian funded or what, fine. That's all fine. I do think that there is a lot of return on investment to have trolls attacking quote unquote influencers in the West, politicians, journalists, and whatnot, in part because it does put you off. It does give you this sense that the system is less stable than it is. And it makes you paranoid and start looking for overreactions, underreactions. How come this is going on? And it took me a little while to get over my anger, not at the anti-Semitic attacks. I've been getting anti-Semitic attacks for a very, very long time. But at the inability of a lot of my sort of peers and colleagues to condemn it. And a lot of them basically took the attitude of, why are you making a big deal about this? They would put pictures of my friend David French's, adopted daughter in a gas chamber with Hitler, with Trump in a SS uniform about to push the button. And I would say, this is disgusting. I don't understand why this isn't being denounced by, and people would say, just ignore it. What's the big deal, kind of thing. And that is a very difficult thing psychologically for people to deal with. And I think I could be wrong, but I just think Russia, the £500 for $500 for a blog post kind of funding is very minor as a budget item, but there's actual real return on investment when you inculcate in people's minds that there are large numbers of actual Nazis out there, or Klansmen, or pedophiles, or whatever. Creating that kind of paranoia is really destabilizing, particularly at these sort of weak points. And I know a lot of journalists who were truly freaked out and stopped tweeting, stopped writing things, were very reluctant to criticize Trump because of the social media attacks. And some of that was obviously, a lot of that was probably just domestic, but I do get the sense that some of those bot farm things from Russia were part of that as well. And it doesn't have to be a huge undertaking to have been influential.
No, I mean, there's no question about the fact that Russia, that they have been doing that, right? The evidence of troll farms, St. Petersburg-based sort of companies that have been sort of flooding social media in the West with disgusting filth and bile and disinformation and all the rest of it. That's been happening, of course. They've been doing that. They've been doing that in order to spread, destabilize our, political systems, disrupt our political conversations. The question mark, though, is, how effective that's been and how much of it that we've seen, we would have been perfectly willing to do to ourselves, even in the absence of Russian interference. So one small data point is this recent study, which got widely publicized over the past couple of weeks. Jan Žilinský, who's another Slovak political scientist working at University of Munich, is one of the co-authors on this. So they looked at the impact of sort of Russian disinformation and social media campaigns in the run-up to the Trump election, and they find very little actual sort of impact on the electoral outcome. However, I mean, your point still stands. I mean, there has been a concerted effort by the Russians to divide us, to just do bad things and spread doubt among Western populations, and it's quite plausible that those efforts worked in some places more effectively than in others. Right? So they didn't really get very far in the Baltic states. They could have possibly gotten much further in a place like Slovakia or Bulgaria or Hungary, where there might be a sort of pre-existing appetite for some of those arguments.
Thousands of fresh deals at your Nordstrom Rack store. Save big today on new arrivals from Sam Edelman, Cole Haan, Adidas, Madewell, and Marc Jacobs. Brands you love, trends you crave, and amazing savings. We're talking up to 60% off. Score so much new at Nordstrom Rack for so much less. But hurry, get first dibs on the season's best, up to 60% off, now at your Nordstrom Rack store. What will you find?
All right, let's go back to the Ukraine stuff. I'm kind of fascinated by this anti-German posturing from Poland. I think it's like, I hate to say it, I think it's kind of awesome. I mean, or at least fascinating. I mean, I don't know. Is that something I should actually be more worried about down the road, or is it just I mean, like you talk about how the Hungarians are paranoid or have this thing about the West trying to dismantle them and the cabal of Jews or whatever in places, that kind of thing. Like, Poland's got a right to air some grievances towards Germany, and if it's driving them to be more supportive of Ukraine, that's all the better.
I think that's basically correct. I mean, I know I like it at the sort of gut level too. I would have some concerns though. One concern is that Poland is a big country and could potentially be a very influential one, including in the EU, and it needs political capital. It needs trust and relationships with other countries and with European institutions in order to be influential and to be effective. And my concern with the current Polish government, which again, they've been wonderful on Ukraine. I mean, Poles have been as a collective whole, just like beyond anything we could have possibly imagined in terms of like how they taken in Ukrainian refugees, going out of their way to help. I mean, I have only good things to say about Poland, but I suspect that Poles could be, I think, playing a sort of different league in terms of building coalitions within the EU and pressing the Germans to do the right thing, and they would be more effective at that if they hadn't squandered some of their political capital on sort of minor things like culture wars with Brussels and talking about German reparations, having these standoffs over the rule of law where it's a complicated question, and I don't want to even put Poland in the same category as Hungary because it is not in the same category. But my fear is that we can end up after the next Polish election, which is this fall, in a situation where there would be, the opposition coming to power, and that would take a much more sort of accommodative stance towards Germany and will try to invest much more into restoring those European relationships while forgetting that there are actual things we want Western Europeans to do in a way that would be a result of this sort of polarized environment in which, I said earlier, that both agree on the big things, but I mean, there are these sort of details of the sort of European policy and who their partners are in the EU that that have become increasingly a sort of polarizing political issue. And it used to be the case that the French and the Germans would have summits with Polish leaders. It was called the Weimar format. The presidents would meet, the foreign ministers would meet, and it just that kind of thing just stopped existing since 2015, since the Law and Justice came to power, partly because of sometimes sort of virulently anti-German rhetoric coming from the Polish side. So I think, Poles could be more influential than they are, and I want them to be more influential. I want them, want their voice to be amplified. But sometimes they're sort of their own worst enemy in that respect. And I mean, it's a very important, I think, sort of task for the Biden administration and for other sort of outside actors that are sort of trusted by both sides to actually help amplify that Polish voice and reward them for good behavior and because they've really done wonderful things, and I want them to play a much sort of bigger political role in Europe than they currently are playing.
It's that that kind of, it's a good segue to the question of Ukrainian membership in the EU. It seems to me, I mean, orders of magnitude more about EU rules than I do, but it seems to me that there's just no way you can quote unquote fast track Ukraine's application, but you can't make it fast. Like, I don't see how those politics work. And so maybe just sort of the level set. I assume you think Ukraine should eventually be part of the EU, but what do you think that the foreseeable timetable for that is?
So I should preface all that by saying that, I sort of found my little niche at AEI working on sort of European questions from a, center-right, free market, conservative-ish perspective, while also being sort of pro-EU as a direct consequence of my visit to Ukraine in 2014. And just a few weeks after the Maidan, speaking to the young Ukrainians for whom this was a sort of very clear-cut civilizational choice. Like, we either try to join the EU and try to emulate what Poland and other Central Eastern European countries had done with success, or we are just sort of stuck in this post-Soviet no man's land of corruption and organized crime and Russian interference and so on and so forth. And it sort of drove home for me that there was something really important that was missing from especially the sort of conversation among English-speaking folks about the EU, that it's not, a sort of plot by Brussels elites to, destroy national sovereignty, but it's in many ways a sort of bottom-up project that does serve important sort of goals that matter for normal people in countries like Poland or Ukraine. That said, there are many problems with the project, and one of them is the fact that it is bureaucratized, rules-based, and technocratic. And in Brussels right now, especially at the European Commission, there is a lot of enthusiasm for Ukraine and Ukraine's membership. I think the Directorate General that deals with these matters, they have beefed up. They're really trying to do their best. But ultimately, I mean, the EU is a body in which the member states have the final say. And the Commission, they have their playbook, which is a very sort of bureaucratic one, consists of ticking boxes and going through the negotiations and opening new chapters. And even if they were very eager to, rush through those negotiations as fast as possible, I mean, there are, like real challenges associated with membership in terms of, getting the reforms in place in Ukraine, getting them up to speed with European rule book and regulations, the so-called acquis communautaire. But even if all that went right, there would be this sort of question of politics in the background, and the sort of question of whether the French and the Germans really want a country of 44 million in the EU, really shifting the sort of political center of gravity to the east. It's a country that is in real terms is at 1/2 of Bulgaria's per capita income, so it's very, very poor. It's very, very agricultural. there'd be sort of real money required for the reconstruction. So it is a tall order to bring Ukraine into the EU now. I think what needs to be done is to sort of think. We need to think creatively about EU membership as being not this binary 0-1 thing where you're either in or you're out, but we need to think about ways in which some of the benefits of EU membership can be extended to Ukraine, not in 20 years' time.
I mean, like Albania has been waiting like 20 years
that's
to join,
exactly
right?
the sort of counterfactual we want to avoid. What happened in the Balkans since late 1990s is a situation in which these countries got candidate status, entered into negotiations, and those negotiations have been stalled for a variety of reasons. And in the meantime, these populations have become more and more embittered with the EU and sometimes playing sort of double-faced games, bringing in China. Like Serbia is the worst in all of this. But you could argue that that's partly a result of the sort of unwillingness of the EU to really take enlargements to the East seriously. And I mean, it's an important debate. Like, can the EU enlarge indefinitely, right? Like, can the EU sort of make decisions at its current size effectively? And if not, would it help to bring in, an even more sort of diverse set of countries in? That's why I think sort of like political leaders need to find ways around it. Like, ultimately, for me, looking beyond this war, like I want Ukraine to be an A+ country, not a B- country, that it was for a very long time before the war. And you can do that by, I guess, sort of creating political incentives in the country to do the right thing and not to revert back to the old corrupt practices. And so actually the EU Commission President von der Leyen said that we need to bring Ukraine into the single market as soon as possible. We need to, and I would argue we need to, bring Ukrainian students into Erasmus programs. We have to bring Ukraine into the Schengen zone of passportless travel and do all these sort of, symbolically important things, in some cases sort of economically meaningful things to sort of integrate Ukraine without making them conditional, going through all the sort of rigors of the accession process. Of course, that cuts totally against the grain of the sort of arguments that Brussels and the Commission and others were making about Brexit, right? Where the mantra was no cherry picking. You're either in or out. You can't really pick, different sort of
That's a good point.
bits and pieces of the integration project. And in retrospect, like that was a mistake, and I think we have to sort of get away from that narrative as soon as possible if the EU is going to take care of its neighborhood effectively. And just to give credit where credit is due to President Macron, his idea of European political community, this sort of platform that would be wider than the EU, which would enable the EU and non-EU nations in Europe and its neighborhood to sort of engage and work on common projects, I think is actually a sound one in which the UK now is being associated with the European EU cooperation on defense policy, for example. Like, the EU needs the Brits as close as possible. The EU needs the Norwegians as close as possible, and the EU also has interest in making sure that the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia are ultimately successful countries, not sort of basket cases run by the Russians and Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a bit of an analog. I've been making the argument. I used to make the argument all the time when most illegal immigration to the U.S. was Mexican. Like, the best way to stop illegal immigration from Mexico is to make Mexico rich, and because most people don't want to leave home if they can live in their country and make money in their country and have a good living for their kids. You become an economic migrant when prospects are bad at home. Make Mexico rich, people will stop wanting to come to a country where they don't speak the language and taking crappy jobs. And but at the same time, if you apply the Schengen stuff to Ukraine, don't you get the sort of Polish plumber problem or the politics of the Polish plumber problem on a massive scale? if you have, a country of 40 million people with were much poorer than Poland, desperate, for higher wages?
Possibly you do, although in this current war, I mean, you've had millions and millions of Ukrainians already leave. You have maybe 4, maybe 5, maybe 6 million Ukrainians living in Poland. Like, the exact numbers are hard to come by. And it's actually going to be a challenge for the Ukrainian leadership after the war to bring these people back, especially if kids get enrolled in schools and people find jobs, etc. And it's been mostly women and children that've been leaving, but still, I mean, the sort of brain drain is an issue. But brain drain was an issue for Poland, for the Baltic states. But I don't think it sort of doomed the economic prospects, right? And many of these people have started coming back. I mean, you can live in Warsaw and enjoy Western European quality of life these days fairly easily if you are a sort of well-educated professional. So that sort of force that drove people away from these countries, I think, is much weaker these days. And the sooner we can get Ukraine to similar per capita levels and similar quality of public services, the less likely it is that the Ukrainians will be sort of flooding Western European labor markets, which, by the way, they haven't been doing even in this war. Like, most of them are staying in Poland, and actually even before the war, the story of Ukrainian immigration to Poland and Belarusian immigration to Poland is a story of an incredible sort of success of integration. I mean, people come in, learn the language in 2 months, and are just sort of integral part of the Polish society. So I'm not terribly fearful. I mean, it's one of those things, like, people who are free, they move around. I mean, that's I guess that's part
that's
of
how we got you.
That's also part of the sort of EU deal, right? Like, if you don't like it, you don't have to do it, but then you're going to miss out on lots of things that actually are sort of enriching and good.
So this is something, this is probably wildly far-fetched, but at the beginning of the Russian invasion, there was a lot of talk about Russia recruiting foreign fighters, right? And the Syrian guys kind of didn't materialize, as far as I can tell, but maybe something. There were a lot of videos in the beginning of, like, large numbers of Syrian soldiers coming and to aid their brother Russians, and nothing seemed to come of that. The Chechens are definitely there. Is there? And I know there are foreign fighters on the Ukrainian side as well, but they're not really organized by other countries. They're not organized by governments. These are basically like the Lincoln Brigades in the Spanish Civil War. They're just sort of voluntary kind of things. Is there any chance that you could see another country actually sending in troops? I think the NATO is going to send troops thing as a non-starter. That's not going to happen. But there's nothing in the NATO charter that says an individual NATO member can't send its own military in. Do you think it's possible? Because at this point, it seems, and again, I'm open to pushback on this, but I've talked to a bunch of foreign policy or military experts who basically think that Poland's military alone could roll up the Russians in fairly short order. Do you think there's a scenario in which some other allied country gets into the fight with Ukraine in a formal way? Like, if the Belarusians, if somebody, if is there some sort of reset of the board that you think could do that without it actually being a NATO versus Russia war?
I think it's very unlikely. When the one thing that could happen, of course, is if the Ukrainians retook control of their skies and it became safe for us to send, trainers in, like the way before the invasion, you had Florida National Guard training Ukrainians in Ukraine, and there have been a bunch of those programs happening. Right now, it just isn't quite safe. I think for what you describe, you would need some really sort of major change happening on the ground, like Russians using a tactical nuclear weapon, right, against Ukrainians, and at that point, it would probably be necessary to send teams to clean that place up and sort of address that sort of radiation issue, and we would probably have to protect those people as well. But in terms of actual fighting against the Russians, that strikes me as wildly implausible.
Yeah, no, me too. It's there's just a certain level of frustration that this war is very winnable if you actually had a full prepared Western army willing to do it, and you could do it without it escalating to a nuclear conflagration or whatever. But
so I would argue that the war is winnable even without that, if we give Ukrainians what we need. And my hope is that, of course, these tanks that are being sent to Ukraine will make a difference on the battlefield. Like the Ukrainians, just to maybe push back against my sort of pessimism at the beginning of the podcast, Ukrainians have consistently exceeded expectations on the battlefield in terms of how they sort of organized militarily. So it is possible that I'm just overly pessimistic, and once we have these sort of tanks coming in, now the talk is about 187 Leopard tanks of the first generation, which are fairly sort of old, but it's a lot of them. And if they get repaired in the Netherlands and Germany and get sent there, like that on top of everything else, on the Challenger tanks and the other newer Leopards, and on top of the Abrams tanks, and if we sort of move ahead with fighter jets, if that doesn't take until 2024, you could imagine Ukrainian military being able to sort of retake those territories and also becoming one of the major, the biggest European military powers as well in the process.
Do you have a theory that's, I know you're not a Russia expert per se, but you're more expert than I, or than me. So we've seen in Ukraine how, first of all, the Russian claims that if you speak Russian, you're a Russian, the sort of the claims that being a Russian speaker is a more powerful source of identity than it's not as powerful a source of identity as the Russians thought it was, right? And that the lot of Russians, including Zelensky, who grew up speaking Russian, it is forcing a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians to embrace Ukrainian, and it's actually pushed them into the Ukrainian identity more, right? Do you have any sense, or have you read anything good? Because I keep looking for this. I'm just, one of the reasons why I didn't think Russia was going to do this is that Putin was right to a certain extent that the history of Russia and Ukraine are so inextricably linked that you can't tell a whole bunch of his original rhetoric was the Ukrainians are our brothers, they are our own, they are Russians, whatever. And the idea that, okay, now we're just going to go slaughter them wholesale didn't quite jibe with that argument, right? To say that, it's just a bunch of drug using neo-Nazis at the top, but the average Ukrainian is one of us. And now this war for almost a year has basically been, close to genocidal in its tactics. And yet I haven't seen anything good about what the Ukrainians in Russia are doing about all this. Because, there are a lot of Russian speakers, or a lot of quote unquote ethnic Russians in Ukraine. There are also a lot of quote unquote ethnic Ukrainians in Russia. And that seems to be sort of a black box. And I've been kind of surprised that there hasn't been more sabotage, more terrorism, and maybe that, and I'm not saying that would be a good thing because that would probably play into Putin's hands, but it just doesn't seem to have materialized. Am I missing a part of the equation?
That's an interesting question. I suspect that there's sort of there's a logic to Russian imperialism which goes hand in hand with the language, right? That sort of Russians are seen as the sort of master nation of this broader Russian world. And you can kind of, join the master nation by sort of embracing the language and joining the ranks and be effectively becoming Russian. I think Ukrainians that left Ukraine for Russia, I don't think there probably haven't been that many over the past decade or so. But those that have been living in Russia, I think have become, they've gone native in the sense that they probably don't see themselves as having a political identity that's distinct from a Russian one, especially if they've been there since before the fall of the Soviet Union. Because really, Ukraine has seen, it has been independent since 1991, but it has seen a sort of cultural and sort of political renaissance and an embrace of a distinctly Ukrainian sort of political culture, particularly after 2014, after the Maidan revolution, where you had millions of people in the streets, 200 killed by the security services, and they were waving EU flags, and they were saying, well, we are not part of the broader Russian world. Like, we are an independent nation. We want to chart our own path. And I'm not sure whether that sort of resonated with somebody who was of Ukrainian extraction living in Russia. But it certainly resonated in that broader Soviet space. You go forward to the 2020 or 2021, the sort of fake election in Belarus stolen by Lukashenko, where you had people in the streets waving the flags of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Right, that present day Belarus was part of for 400 years, and so these Russian claims about yes, like the history of Ukraine and Russia is linked, but it's linked in complicated ways, and actually much of Ukraine and also of Belarus was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for longer time than it's been part of sort of Russian run. Either Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. So I don't think it's a sort of very as clear-cut case as the Russians would like us to believe, and it's certainly not the case that's very compelling to the Ukrainians themselves.
All right, we gotta wrap up. I gotta get on a plane in a minute, but I do want to ask a question about, because you talk about the Ukrainian political identity. These arguments about whether Ukraine is really just part of Russia historically and culturally and all that, I think are very interesting as a historical, intellectual matter, but they don't really matter to me in the sense that Ukraine became a country. It's a country. Everyone said it was a country. It had borders, and you don't get to unilaterally send tanks over a border because you don't like that border anymore. And I get very frustrated with the quote unquote nationalists in America who constantly talk about the importance of borders and constantly talk about the importance of national identity, and then have nothing but scorn for the concept of Ukrainian national identity when it's clearly a thing for Ukrainians. And, but when listening to you talk about this sort of burgeoning Ukrainian identity, how similar or different is that between the Slovakian national identity and Ukrainian identity? Because, I lived in the last year of Czechoslovakia, and I remember talking to Slovakians and Czechs who would just simply say, this is the Balkan War was going on at the time, and I would ask them, would you fight to either get out of Czechoslovakia or would you fight to keep the Slovakians in? And I never met a person who didn't say to one extent or another, are you kidding me? You want me to kill people to keep them if they don't want to be here? Or do you want me to kill people to get away? It was not in the blood kind of thing. But in the last 20 years, and you correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is there's been a concerted effort to embrace linguistic differences between Slovak and Czech, which I never really, when I lived there, people talk about this Slovakian dialect to the extent they did at all as basically the equivalent of Southern dialect compared to Northern dialect in America. It was the same language, but, really minor differences. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Well, so Slovak and Czech have always been two distinct languages, and you would have to go to the 19th century, really, where sort of the Slovak, national movement was trying to use Czech as the sort of language for writing and sort of literature, and that really didn't go anywhere. So you had sort of Slovak codified fairly early on as a sort of distinct language. It is true that the two languages were to Czech and Slovak speakers were perfectly sort of mutually understandable just because of the closeness of the cultural connections. That closeness still exists, but there is less of it, especially on the Czech side. So Slovaks are much more exposed to Czech broadcasting, Czech literature, Czech political conversation. It's a bigger market, bigger country, more stuff gets published, more TV shows are being made. So sometimes, like when I speak to like young Czechs, they sort of wonder what particular Slovak words might mean. But one can still get away speaking one of the two languages and being understood. But to your broader question, there is an interesting parallel between the Slovak experience and the Ukrainian one, which is the risk of oversimplifying. Both countries in the early 1990s were sort of handed over their independence on a plate, and both countries took a while to figure out what to do with that independence. Slovakia, there was this sort of active nationalist movement, but it was far from commanding a sort of majority support for Slovakia's independence. So it came as a little bit of a shock in 1992 when the decision was made. Basically, the Czech Prime Minister, Václav Klaus at the time, just couldn't deal with the Slovaks anymore and told them, you want independence, you go, there's the door. And that was it. So I was actually, part of my family is Czech. I was 8 at the time. We were not exactly thrilled by the prospect of Slovakia's independence. And the years that followed were very complicated for Slovakia, being excluded from EU enlargements and NATO enlargements. And so in Ukraine, you had the same thing on steroids. So you also had the sort of post-communist elite in Kiev trying to take control of the country, and nobody knew what was happening in Moscow, the central government. So you had all these republics basically declare independence so that they can be run as the sort of fiefdoms of the sort of local former Communist Party elites. And Ukraine, unlike Slovakia, which was in a more benign international environment and had more connections to the West, Ukraine really squandered close to 2 decades of its existence as an independent nation, just sort of being caught in this sort of vicious cycle of corruption and government dysfunction and organized crime and Russian government buying politicians in Ukraine and having these deals over natural gas and so on and so forth. And it really took Ukrainians refer to 2014 as the revolution of dignity, when they sort of took things into their own hands and said, we want to chart our own course, independent of Russia and just very different from what was the norm in the post-Soviet space. Slovaks never really had to make those same sorts of sacrifices. Like, we always somehow just got by being in the right place geographically and doing the sort of minimum to get into NATO and the EU. And I think it will be interesting to sort of watch whether that's sustainable or whether the country's political elites will ultimately decide to really take it down the path of Hungary and dismantle some of the very sort of real achievements that Slovakia has seen since its independence.
All right, Dalibor Rohac, it's great to have you. Thank you for doing this, and hope to have you back.
Thank you so much, Jonah.
All right, so Dalibor has left the studio, and I got to leave my hotel room momentarily. It was great, if a little on the sobering side, to hear his takes on all this stuff. And And I should disclose, just as people know, my wife's working on a book about her dad. Dalibor has been very helpful to my wife, but that is not how he got onto this podcast. And beyond that, I'll see you next time.
Nie uvidíte, toto je podcast.
Hey guys, this is Keenan Thompson. I have a problem with you. Yes, you. None of y'all told me that AutoTrader has millions of new and used cars that I can shop from home. I thought we were friends. I put smiles on your face, but I'm not smiling. No one told me that with AutoTrader, a dealer can deliver cars to my home or that I could shop by price on AutoTrader. No one. Consider this friendship that you just learned we had officially over. Finally, it's easy. AutoTrader.